Trump versus Petro.
Trump versus Petro. President Petro is a drug trafficker, shouted Donald Trump just minutes ago on his social network, Truth. In addition, Trump accompanied his words with the threat of cutting off the alleged US subsidies to Colombia. To make matters worse, Colombian journalists determined that at least one of the supposed Venezuelan drug boats, destroyed by US armed forces, was actually a Colombian fishing boat working in Colombian territorial waters. Trump versus Petro, a new front of conflict for the United States. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Buenos días desde Buenos Aires, Argentina. Comenzamos la transmisión número 280 de
We're starting broadcast number 280 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship, both on this platform and through our social media, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Also remember to join us on our sister channel, MP Geopolitics, and on our Demolishing Myths channel in English. The link is in the description. On the other side of the screen, and across the Atlantic Ocean, we're joined by Fernando Moragón from Madrid, Spain. Fernando, how are you? Everything good over there?
Fernando Moragón desde Madrid, España. Fernando, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Bien, bien. Hoy tengo que confesar que he estado en casa.
All right. Today I have to confess that I was at the house of a mutual friend of Ezequiel and Neo, and that's where the evidence appears that I've been bought by the Russians. I mean, among other things, I ate Russian salad, made by a Russian. Yes! This isn't, and another salad that's typical from there, from Odessa and so on, also made by the same Russian. So, then I think this is undeniable proof that I'm on Putin's payroll.
The suspicions have been confirmed. Finally, the Russian agent.
Fernando Moragón, eating Russian salad, wearing this t-shirt that you can't see, but well, I've shown it many times before. What it says in Russian has nothing to do with Putin. It's something like, I'm not sad, I'm sober. Anyway.
Estoy sobrio. No.
Buena frase. Sí. Querido Fernando.
Good line. Dear Fernando, how about we start with the first topic, the situation in Ukraine, both militarily and politically. But let's begin with this, the main topic of this broadcast. This is the beginning of the story, at least for today. Just a few minutes ago, the following message was posted on Donald Trump's social network, Truth. The president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, is a drug trafficking leader who encourages the mass production of drugs, both in large and small fields, throughout Colombia. It has become, by far, the biggest business in Colombia, and Petro is doing nothing to stop it, despite the large-scale payments and subsidies from the United States, which are nothing more than a long-term scam. As of today, these payments or any other form of subsidy will no longer be made to Colombia. The purpose of this drug production is the mass sale of the product to the United States, causing death, destruction, and havoc. Petro is a little-known and very unpopular leader with a cold attitude toward the United States. He should shut down these extermination fields immediately, or the United States will shut them down for him, and he will not be well received. Thank you for your attention to this matter. President Donald J. Trump. Fernando, your first impression of this?
Primera impresión sobre esto.
A ver, ya sabes aquella famosa frase de que la realidad.
You know that famous saying about not letting reality ruin a good speech. In this case, a good narrative, a good movie, whatever you want to call it. How malicious, I mean. So since Petro has protested rightly so, and supported Venezuela rightly so, well then, fine, since they're neighbors, let's just extend it. What applies to Venezuela now applies to Colombia. Now they're all drug traffickers. How malicious. I don't know who'll be next. Well, not Panama, because of the canal and all that, but maybe someone else around there. In other words, it's just another way to keep inflating the anti-Venezuelan rhetoric, this time through Petro. who has already proven to be a strong defender of Venezuelans against the attacks launched by the United States. Attacks in every direction, against all kinds of ships and vessels, against everything except actual drug trafficking, if you know what I mean.
De cualquier cosa menos de narcotráfico, para que nos entendamos. Y bueno, es decir,
Well, I mean, Trump has to create a speech, a narrative, in which he has to justify a hypothetical or possible aggression against Venezuela, which is the key to all of this. And then, well, if we throw Colombia into the mix as well, great. But this is the key, because it's the strategic country for the United States. Let's put ourselves in this situation, which is where we are now. That is, globalization is over. Supply chains are getting worse every day. There's a rupture in the world. That doesn't mean international trade is going to stop, but it's not going to be what it was intended to be, or what it once was. Globalization, understood, moreover, in the Anglo-Saxon sense.
la globalización entendida además en el sentido anglosajón. Esto ya nos lo contó en su momento el señor de BlackRock.
Larry Fink, the man from BlackRock, already told us this at the time, right? In this rupture, Trump has made it clear from the very beginning. We are living in a world, and I already mentioned this on Friday's show, where we're going to face increasing scarcity, mainly of fossil products, that is, fossil energy. Not only fossil, also uranium and so on, even renewables and strategic minerals. Lacking energy and strategic minerals, the United States, as a good imperialist predator, must seize resources, because without resources it wouldn't even have the capacity to confront, well, not even remotely, China. Even with resources it doesn't have the capacity, but without them, even less.
Tampoco tiene capacidad, pero sin recursos menos. ¿Y qué es lo que tiene? Por eso coge y dice, señores...
And what does it have? That's why he goes and says, ladies and gentlemen, we're competing against the Chinese. And it turns out that since Canada has oil, let's not forget, Alberta's oil, which is mostly oil sands, very poor quality, but they have a lot of it. So, well, we'll stick with Canada, let it be the 51st state. Come on, fine. And Greenland, which also has oil, we'll take Greenland too. We'll buy it from the Danes. What do they need it for anyway? After all, there are just a few polar bears and a few inhabitants there. Besides, something important. The thing about Greenland is that it has rare earths.
El tema de Groenlandia pues tiene tierras raras. Tiene tierras raras y además es uno de los sitios
It has rare earths, and moreover, it's one of the places identified for setting up. And here we get into another of the disputes with the Chinese over artificial intelligence. The famous data farms, those huge servers that need enormous amounts of energy and also cooling. Well, for cooling, Canada and Greenland are excellent. What's the other major energy resource that will be needed in a world where there will be energy wars due to scarcity? Venezuela, which, let's not forget, has the world's largest oil reserves. So they have to go after them. And in fact, they say it quite clearly. There's a report, I think from the New York Times, if I remember correctly, that said, and it sounds quite plausible, that President Maduro, in order to avoid an American attack, had offered the United States some absolutely privileged conditions, according to the newspaper. In other words, he had offered that all American companies would have access to the oil fields under preferential conditions, with special prices, all kinds of advantages, and he even offered to expel the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians. Yes, Fernando, what did the United States say about this? Nothing, right? What does that mean? They're going after them.
All right, correct. Obviously, besides being a Russian agent, you're also a Colombian agent. Because in President Petro's response a few minutes ago to Trump's insults, he said exactly the same thing you said in your analysis. We'll show it next. Well, I hadn't read it.
The issue in the Caribbean Sea, which has nothing to do with fentanyl, is that what the United States is really after is the oil from Venezuela and Guyana. Oil greed is what lies behind the strategy that's firing missiles at fishermen. There are already fishermen from the island of Trinidad and Tobago who were killed by a missile. A video is already circulating of a boat that wasn't sailing, but had its engines lifted and was therefore stationary, and a missile hit it. We still don't know the exact location. There are already young fishermen who left their homes in Santa Marta and haven't returned.
En Santa Marta y no han vuelto. Aún no es tiempo de decir lo definitivo, pero nos...
It's not yet time to say anything definitive, but we are concerned because their families are calling. I ask all families in whose homes their sons or husbands are not returning under strange circumstances, in areas where there are ports, to immediately notify the authorities, and we will see what has happened to them. Because if what is happening is that some Colombians have died under the missiles, I have asked all human rights lawyers, to whom we apologize today because the Colombian state murdered and persecuted them in past decades, to help us establish at both the international and national levels the lawsuits and complaints if Colombians have been killed by the missiles. Colombia approved the resolution that all drug policy must be subject to human rights. General Austin Alvim, Admiral Alvim, head of the United States Southern Command, has resigned. I take off my civilian hat to you, Admiral. If you resign because you don't want to be complicit in a violation in a war crime, welcome. We want the same thing. The weapons of any army in the world cannot be used against humanity. I said it in the streets of New York, and I repeat it on this program, even less so in the Caribbean Sea, and even less against Colombian men and women, innocent fishermen. I ask President Trump to restrain his oil greed, to think of humanity, to think of the true greatness of America. A great America is one where the peoples who inhabit the Americas, from Alaska to Patagonia, without exclusion, engage in dialogue about their common problems. Because through dialogue and reasoned arguments, we can overcome our problems.
Fernando,
Fernando, good. Petro is increasingly becoming one of the strongest voices in the Americas against Trump's policies. By the way, here's the testimony gathered by Colombian television from a relative of a fisherman who was apparently killed, with all indications suggesting that the attack took place in Colombian territorial waters. Also, we'll present the reference to Trump's words in a moment.
That happened in Colombian waters? Indeed, it must have been in Colombian waters, in the La Guajira area. Well, people say, people speculate. We're also in a sea of speculation. And then people see the video and say, oh, well, that white stuff there, that was cocaine. And President Trump is asked the question at a press conference. A journalist says to him, what allows you to claim that it was a drug boat? President Trump replies, no. You have to see that the cocaine and the drugs, the fentanyl, went out and spread across the sea. And what is that white thing we see there, in your opinion? Well, when fishing activities are carried out, it's normal for the boats doing this work to carry a trammel net, a seine, to surround the fish by circling around and then collecting them. That white thing you see is part of a net we know as a trammel or seine, used to enclose the fish and bring them up onto the boat.
Well, Fernando, now the issue of fentanyl has also come up. The new claim, fentanyl supposedly being transported by boat from Venezuela, according to Trump, to the United States. That's new, because in reality, fentanyl is produced in the United States with ingredients that, at best, come from China, but nothing beyond that.
Yes, no, I've seen it. I just saw it right now. They were transporting it in canoes by rowing. Yes, in canoes there. This is just madness. Well, no, wait. I'm also seeing right now that there are protests from global oceanographic associations because they're noticing that much of the marine fauna is behaving strangely due to fentanyl. All the fish are drugged.
That is to say then, right?
Indeed being there. Well, the thing is, the speech doesn't hold up. I mean, this idea that, let's see, whether it's fentanyl, whatever, or cocaine and so on, heroin, salt, I don't know, it could be anything. The point here is that Trump has to keep justifying the hypothetical, more than possible aggression against Venezuela. And since he has no way to justify aggression against Venezuela, let's say, for normal reasons, he has to do it by making things up. And not only does he invent the narrative, not only does he make up what he says, but he also has to back it up with certain pieces of evidence, so to speak, let's say visual evidence. So he basically says, I'll take out one boat here, another fishing boat there. What does it matter? It's the least of it. I'll just say they're drug traffickers. Since it can't be proven, and in any case it's my word against Maduro's, against Petro's, and so on, well, that's it. Since I have more media outlets on my side, it's my version that stands. That's it. I mean, this is absolutely the least of it. I'm almost sure they basically get the order that on a certain day, today, tomorrow, whenever, they have to destroy a boat, any boat, find one and destroy it. What does it matter? Whatever it is, it's the least of it. I mean, if it's the least of it, whether they're fishermen, tourists, or anyone else, it doesn't matter. And that's it. That is what for? To be able to show some images saying that, well, they're terrorists, narco-terrorists, and so on. But come on, it doesn't hold up. I mean, it's something that even within the United States they've criticized, because they say, hey, if those hypothetical boats are carrying drugs, with all the resources the U.S. currently has deployed in the Caribbean, stop them. It's the easiest thing in the world. I mean, go there, capture them, arrest their occupants. What everyone else does, by the way. Here in Spain, where there's also drug trafficking and speedboats and such, the police show up, arrest them, bring them ashore, show whoever's involved, what everyone does. Why don't they do that? Because it's a lie. I mean, because there's no cocaine, because there's no heroin, because there's nothing, because they're not drug traffickers, because they're anything else but not drug traffickers. So, well, they just visually support their narrative by occasionally blowing up one of those boats. And that's it. Nothing more. A barge, nothing more. As I said, it would be extremely easy for the United States to capture one of these supposed drug boats and show the world, well, the traffickers, who they are, where they come from, with their testimonies and the product they were carrying. They don't do it. Because they don't even bother to create evidence, to fabricate somewhat more convincing proof. They don't care.
Because this would be very easy, I mean. Here is more evidence, specifically about the attack on a fishing boat. This is the testimony. Now, the testimony of, if I remember correctly, the wife of one of the murdered fishermen.
Well, I presented it to the media, and outlets like CBS and others around the world published it on September 16th. But here's the news. The information obtained by RTVC Noticias, the national public media system. That boat was Colombian, and at least one of the people who died there was a Colombian citizen named Alejandro Carranza, a fisherman. He'd been a fisherman his whole life, about 40 years old. And I'm asking a favor from one of his relatives, his first cousin, Audelis Manjares. Is that correct? Audelis, tell us, who was Alejandro, and is this the video you're seeing right now?
¿Quién era Alejandro y si es el video que estás viendo en este momento?
Bueno, Alejandro Carranza es pescador.
Well, Alejandro Carranza is a fisherman. We come from fishing families. And well, he's there because he's a curious person. He's with the engines, they're stranded, and it's not fair that they were bombed like that, being innocent people.
Bueno, por aquí además, otra de
Well,
las
here's another piece of evidence.
evidencias, esto de aquí.
Of course, look, in the video you can clearly see the interview, how it's a fishing area, and how the boats obviously aren't going to be rowed. In other words, they have motors.
No van a ir a remo, es decir, llevan motores, normal, es decir, aquí se ve.
Precisamente
It's normal. I mean, there's actually an interesting difference between the boats used by fishermen in Colombia and in Venezuela. The ones from Venezuela have more powerful engines, and that's how they were able to determine that the boat didn't come from Venezuela, but from Colombia. Here's the explanation, if the camera can help me.
Si la cámara me ayuda, estamos viendo, quédate aquí, Denis. Si la cámara me ayuda,
We can see, stay here if the camera helps me, in the background those two gray boats with two engines. Talking with the fishermen, they point out that this is the typical Colombian Eduardoño boat, the one all fishermen have, at least in the Colombian Caribbean, and that it's quite different from Venezuelan boats, which would have more power and a different shape. Is that correct? You can also see that clearly in the video.
de otra forma. ¿Es correcto? Fue algo que también se ve claro en el video para ustedes.
Sí, señor.
Yes, sir, of course.
Claro, ¿qué pasa? Que todo-
Well, even those boats over there, just like the ones in the video, those you can see there, exactly the same.
Ahí se podían ver con dos
You could see them there with two engines and with four. Pretty normal, I mean.
quiero decir,
But
pero que
we're looking at a fishing port.
estamos viendo
So what's the problem? Are all those boats supposed to belong to drug traffickers? It's laughable. If it weren't for the tragedy that people are being killed.
por la tragedia de que están matando gente. Es decir, es
Aquí
una
el
cosa
video
delirante.
difundido también.
Here's a video released just minutes ago, fresh off the press. A new attack, presented by Pete Hegseth. A new attack against a boat. According to Pete Hegseth, it was transporting narcotics without any proof, and with more and more fishermen disappearing, not only in Colombia, but also in Trinidad and Tobago, which, by the way, is politically an ally of the United States. To wrap up the topic, Fernando, before moving on to the next one of the things discovered in Trump's post. This is the Spanish translation, but this is the original post in English. Ah, now corrected.
Original en inglés. Ay, ahora corregido, qué hijos de su madre. Bueno, en lugar de Colombia.
What a bunch of bastards. Well, instead of Colombia, the original post said Columbia. Yes, British Columbia. Of course, British Columbia, spelled differently in English. And they're such idiots. Not just Trump, whom Juan Antonio very aptly calls an intellectual beggar, but his advisors too, throughout the entire statement. Colombia, Colombia, Colombia. They can't even figure out how to spell the word Colombia, the name of the country. That's the level of ignorance of these murderers. Meanwhile, to wrap this up, yes, Fernando, sorry.
Y redondeamos acá la cuestión. Sí, Fernando, perdón.
No, quería que hacer referencia justo a rectificar el.
No, I just wanted to clarify something.
Era el New York
The
Times,
newspaper I mentioned that reported this was last week's New York Times.
que es un-
And Alex Kreiner, who is a geopolitical and geoeconomic analyst, said something very interesting that I mentioned yesterday. And it's that, as I told you before, well, according to the New York Times, they offered him everything. In the deal they were discussing, Maduro's negotiators and Trump's negotiators offered to open all existing and future oil and gold projects to U.S. companies, give those companies preferential contracts, reverse the flow of Venezuelan oil exports toward the United States, and cut his country's energy and mining contracts with Chinese and Russian companies.
Y recortar los contratos de energía y minería de su país con empresas chinas, iraníes y rusas. Y les daban todo. Y según el periódico dijeron no.
They gave him everything, and according to the newspaper, they told him no. Well, they also told him no. And what is this man's hypothesis, which is very interesting? Alex Kreiner says the following. Well, then why? He says because they're not interested in the oil. Let me explain, or rather, Alex Kreiner explains it. He says the following. With political control of Caracas, Venezuelan resources become a guarantee for U.S. and Western banks.
Se convierten en garantía de los bancos estadounidenses y occidentales. Sus clientes, como empresas que British Petroleum, Shell,
Its clients, companies like Petroleum, Shell, ExxonMobil, even the Venezuelan state itself, in the event of a change of power, and whether it's Corina Machado or any puppet governing Venezuela, could obtain credit backed by oil, gold, and other Venezuelan resources. In this way, Venezuela's natural wealth magically turns into profit-generating assets on the balance sheets of banks like Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and others. This relationship highlights the incentive that has driven Venezuelan imperialism, well, everywhere. That is, the underlying idea is, if you've been offered everything and you say no, why do you say no? Precisely because it creates guarantees for the banks. In other words, material resources like oil, if you have them under control because you've installed a puppet like Corina Machado there and you control Venezuela, serve as collateral for potential financial operations by U.S. banks, which would end up generating loans, bailouts, and profits. That's how clear it is. In other words, according to Alex Kreiner, financial power would go even further and wouldn't just want the oil, but would want it as collateral in order to make loans. And from there, they make unpayable loans, as has practically been happening since 2008 or even earlier. And those unpayable loans ultimately will be paid by the United States, by the government, just like with previous bank bailouts. So a perfect deal. For example, he mentioned the case of Alberta's oil. They said that to appreciate the magnitude of this incentive, in the case of Alberta's proven oil reserves, 165 billion barrels, once they came under the control of Rockefeller's interests in New York, they provided $9 million in new guarantees. Most of those guarantees ended up fueling the $5 trillion mortgage bubble that burst in 2007-2008. After the bailout, the banks took at least $16 trillion in profits, which amounts to $42,000 for every person living in the United States. This would be the financial trick, so to speak, that the Americans also want. In other words, they don't just want the oil, they want control of the country in order to control the oil and use that oil, which would practically be theirs, as collateral for all those financial operations. An idea I find interesting from Alex Kreiner.
Really interesting analysis. By the way, the situation in the United States, the internal situation, seems tremendously turbulent, even showing signs of the possibility of a civil war in the not-so-distant future. So, let's show the images of the protests that took place yesterday throughout the United States, but above all, in the major European cities. According to media outlets close to the Democrats, these protests involved 7 million Americans across the country. This, here in Boston, the protest, the demonstration under the name No to Kings, in open opposition to Trump, of course. Here images from Chicago, also massive, lots of people, and well, this, Chicago. Over here, images from New York as well. Now these are the images from New York. All the major cities in the United States protesting against Trump for his authoritarianism, for his interventions also in American cities, increasingly with federal forces and Trump's takeover of control. Cities, first Washington, then, if I remember correctly, I don't recall exactly which one was second, but several already announced, among them Chicago, Portland, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I don't remember if Boston as well. The threat to New York, from the possible election of not a socialist, but a communist, as very likely the next mayor of New York, communist and Muslim, on top of that Muslim. Well, this is Trump's internal situation, his perspective on this. Fernando, how do we conceptualize it?
Notice that we were already saying, back in 2024, when Biden was still in office, that a civil war was very likely, that it was very possible, and that there were many elements shaping it. Well, what this shows us is that the tension, the confrontation, is growing stronger and more irreconcilable between the Democrats and their electorates, their voters, the people who support them, and the Republicans. and a Trump who indeed is determined to impose, let's say, his law, well, if you can call it law, that is, to impose himself by any means.
Digamos su ley, por llamarlo ley, es decir, a imponerse de cualquier manera. Estas protestas, además, si te fijas, la mayoría de los sitios que estamos...
These protests, moreover, if you notice, most of the places we're seeing images from are in fact democratic areas, like New York. That is to say, it's the usual thing. We're also seeing that polarization in what Trump is doing, indeed, with the takeover of cities. He's done it in Washington, I think also in Illinois, in Detroit. He's directly targeting democratic cities, even California. San Francisco has already said it's a very dangerous place, that things are really bad and that troops need to be sent there. Well, in a sense, let's say the general would be carrying out a kind of soft coup. Exactly that, huh? A coup d'etat, so to speak, in installments, step by step.
Digamos, por capítulos, por entregas, paso a paso, o sea, hoy una ciudad, mañana otra, luego otra.
I mean, today it's one city, tomorrow another, then another. Well, that's how things are moving forward. But as I said, it's a very clear confrontation, a polarization, a division within American society. And there's no turning back from this. I mean, we've already seen it in many ways. Look, starting with the challenge we talked about in 2024 from the Republican governor of Texas, when Biden was still in office, against the federal government, where the governor of Texas, backed by the National Guard, came out on top, and it could have even led to a military clash with the federal army. Well, now we're seeing the same thing, but the other way around. For example, there's a very clear challenge from the governor of California, a Democrat, against Donald Trump.
Con respecto a Donald Trump, y lo vimos cuando las manifestaciones de inmigrantes.
And we saw it when there were demonstrations by immigrants and people supporting immigrants facing the police in charge of detaining them, and so on. This is growing and will continue to grow, that's clear. Therefore, that confrontation is only going to get bigger. These are two power groups fighting head-on. And to make matters worse, the Democrats, for now, haven't managed to produce any kind of proto-candidate, so to speak, who could be the visible face to stand up to Trump. You still hear, for example, American media saying, "No, we can still count on Kamala Harris. Please, you'd have to be crazy to count on Kamala Harris. That woman is just useless now." Yes, exactly.
Pero se está oyendo, es decir, cosas de estas. Pero vamos.
But it's being heard, I mean, things like that. Anyway, the one who's basically leading these protests, this fight against Trump, is the governor, I can't remember his name, the governor of California, which, let's not forget, is one of the, well, actually, it's probably the most important state. From an economic standpoint, it's the richest state. I mean, I think it's often said, yes, in terms of population, too. Also, that if it were an independent country, it would be like the 5th largest economy or something like that in the world. So this is what we're seeing, another episode of that confrontation, which, since the majority is also trying, let's say, to get rid of the Democrats or the Democratic figures they can go after, well, it's going to keep going. And also, changing the subject, let's not forget that one of the things we saw yesterday or the day before was how a guy who's a nutcase, well, a dangerous nutcase, especially when he had some power, like Bolton, well, Mr. Bolton showed up before the police or before the judge because the FBI or some other agency issued a warrant for his arrest. And he's a sworn enemy of Trump because during his first term he was, I think, national security advisor or something like that. And they ended up at each other's throats because this guy was crazy. After that, Bolton, out of revenge, wrote a memoir about his time in the government, spilling details, bad-mouthing Trump and so on, and he had it in for him. Well, we're going to see this kind of thing whenever we can.
So far, the Trump administration has carried out the intervention of the capital, Washington, D.C. There, it conducted a direct action with National Guard forces and ended up taking the city by force. With the capture of political power in Los Angeles, California, they sent troops in response to protests against the mass deportations from some time ago. But in addition, according to reports, they also dispatched forces to Memphis, in the state of Tennessee, and to Chicago. For now, only 300 National Guard troops to Chicago and Illinois. Moreover, there is also the threat of deployment and intervention, or rather the intervention, of Portland, San Francisco, New Orleans, Baltimore, New York City, of course St. Louis and Oakland. So basically, Trump's sights are set on the major cities, not by coincidence, all of them historically democratic, right?
Todas ellas históricamente demócratas, ¿verdad? Y a propósito de guerras civiles y del estado de...
And speaking of civil wars and the state of confrontation within US politics and society, is this Trump's response to these protests, according to social media close to the Democratic Party? The largest in US history, with 7 million people. Maybe it wasn't 7, maybe 3 took part. Still, a remarkable demonstration, one that any president in the world should acknowledge as part of American society, as part of the political situation. Trump responded, in true Trump fashion, like this. Pay attention to this video posted on his social media.
Atención a este video publicado en sus redes sociales.
Do you remember the name of the protest? No to Kings, or No Kings, referring to Trump. Take a look at the graffiti on this plane. This, of course, made with artificial intelligence and posted on his Truth Network, King Trump. And now, pay attention to King Trump taking off. There's King Trump, in a fighter jet, wearing a crown. With the crown, bombing with... crap, basically. All of this made with artificial intelligence. Honestly, even for Trump, Fernando, this is a bit much, isn't it? Half the country up in protest, and your response is this, you with a crown, dropping crap on the population. Even by Trumpian standards, Fernando, a bit much, right?
Aún en términos trampianos, Fernando, un poquito fuerte, ¿no?
I'm no longer used to posting eccentric videos and photos doing things like that. Well, I mean, this is typical of the degradation of politics in the West, and specifically in the United States. Does anyone think that if there were a demonstration or whatever, Xi Jinping or Putin would be posting things like that on social media? It's unthinkable. But anyway, since we have a circus show kind of politics in the United States, more than ever, I mean, show politics in the United States has always existed, but now more than ever. This has turned into a circus in which Trump is the main clown and can get away with these things and, well, nothing happens. I mean, in a serious country, that is with a serious president, first he wouldn't do it. And if he did, the world would come crashing down on him. But well, this is the United States. This is America. Well, we can see that he's a president who spends his time doing these things, making videos throwing crap at people. But anyway, it also means, look, when he does this, even if it's in very poor taste and all that, he doesn't do it because he suddenly snaps and says, I'm going after them, they're getting on my nerves, let's throw some virtual crap at them. No, he does it because it polarizes. That is, let's not forget that Trump benefits from polarization. He wants people to be divided, and for the Republicans who support him to become more polarized. And he's been going through a kind of low point, mainly because of the Epstein issue. Well, we all know what that's about. I don't even know how to say the word. Being a friend of Epstein. And then later, with the whole Charlie Kirk thing, and the alleged murder, mentioned by people like Tucker Carlson and many others, or Candace Owens, involving the Mossad. That is to say, this has hurt him among his own base. Well, these are responses meant to encourage, let's say, radicalism, to promote Trumpism within his own ideological sphere, within his own electoral base, because what he wants is polarization. So, well, these things may seem very bad to us, but Americans might find them quite amusing, especially the MAGA crowd and so on. I mean, I understand that many times these things will seem absurd to sensible people around the world, and especially outside the United States. But this isn't a coincidence. I mean, in general, all these kinds of things are aimed at the American public, a public that accepts and is receptive to this kind of cheap propaganda.
Efectivamente, con Trump como elemento común.
Indeed, with Trump as the common thread, we begin to present the third topic of this broadcast, focusing on Gaza, following the open violation of the ceasefire and today's attacks on civilians by the Israeli armed forces. By the way, on this note, we ask all our supporters to please give us a thumbs up right now, because all previous videos, all previous analyses on these topics, have been demonetized, including the latest talk with Juan Antonio Aguilar. This is considered a taboo subject because they decide to censor these issues. So please help us out, especially when we address all these matters. Let's start with Trump himself as the common element in an interview yesterday about Gaza, specifically on Fox.
Sobre Gaza, precisamente en la Fox. Atención a Trump.
Attention to Trump.
Señor Trump,
Mr. Trump, you said you wanted to develop real estate in Gaza. So, do you actually want to do a real estate development there?
inmobiliario allí. Y esta la respuesta de Trump.
And this was Trump's response.
Bueno, no yo personalmente, yo no quiero desarrollarlo personalmente.
Well, no, I personally don't want to develop it. My companies aren't going to do it themselves. But I like to call it the place of freedom in English, Freedom Place. And here begins, attention, the description of this supposed place of freedom, Freedom Place, with an open confession of the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Pay attention to the outrageous things Trump said yesterday in this interview, when he, comfortable with this pro-government Fox journalist, gave this response. We would put all the people who live there in houses, in decent homes, throughout the region. If you look, Egypt has a lot of land. Jordan has a lot of land, you know?
Right next door. A lot of countries have a lot of land. So
Los países limítrofes.
Many countries have a lot of territory. The countries bordering Gaza have a lot of territory.
get them. Look at Gaza. I mean,
Por eso yo tenía inicialmente la visión de que los íbamos a tratar.
That's why I initially had the vision that we were going to bring them. And then he abandons the sentence halfway through. Look at what Gaza is now. Nothing is left standing. It's just rubble.
Escombros.
it's all rubble. So it's not too hard to top that.
Por eso no es difícil.
That's why it's not hard to improve that situation.
And so you'd say it's a whole new set of people.
Por eso, perdón, Israel puede decir que nosotros.
Israel can say that we killed 50,000 people. And that's why there's a need for a lot of new people. They're then replaced by younger people. Yes, first of all, the official number of dead isn't 50,000, but 70,000. In reality, many more. But well, that's the official figure. Their proposal is basically to replace them with younger people in Israel, obviously, and to relocate the people from Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza, to Egypt and Jordan. Put that way, yes, more. And a real estate development, by the way, right? By the way, a few dollars.
Algunos dolaretes.
Efectivamente, no, diría Trump, no, yo no voy a hacer negocio con...
Indeed, no. Trump would say, no, I'm not going to do business with my companies. My son-in-law, Jared Kushner, will, because he can, since he's not the president. Now, this has at least two things. I mean, aside from, well, these delusions of turning Gaza into a beach resort and a tax haven too. But anyway, on one hand, the cynicism and the admission, no, we've killed here 50,000, 60,000, 70,000, probably more. And well, with the idea of carrying out an ethnic cleansing, I mean an ethical cleansing, no, please, I don't know what I was thinking. That is, a population transfer to push this plan forward. Something that is condemned and prohibited by the United Nations and by international law, and so on. But it doesn't matter. And then there's also the fact that if this is really what he thinks, it's absolutely, let's say, absurd.
Digamos, absurda. O sea, vamos a ponernos en que no somos completamente inmorales.
I mean, let's imagine we're being completely moral. We don't care at all if we kill 200,000 or 2,000, whatever. So we empty Gaza, right? Fine. As everyone knows, it's already in ruins, and we don't care. And we're going to replace it with rabbis, and so on. Okay, and then the story goes that today, Jordan, Egypt, this is very old. So what's the thesis? On one hand, the cleansing of Gaza for reasons of a shared border. It has to be toward Egypt. The ethnic cleansing of Jordan has to be toward Jordan because it borders more, basically. This isn't new, huh? It's a very old thesis. You see, when all those radicals, ultra-Orthodox and the like, were asked, they said, no, but a Palestinian state is impossible. No.
No, pero Estado palestino imposible. No, porque además ya tienen uno. ¿Y cuál es ese Estado?
Because they already have one. And what state is that? Well, Jordan, where it's true that the majority of the population is Palestinian. But anyway, that's another story. So first it takes up a very old thesis, and then it's grounded in reality. Because no matter how much he crosses himself, no matter what he does, he knows perfectly well, or should know, his advisors should know, that you can't carry out an ethnic cleansing toward Egypt, because that would completely destabilize Egypt, and anything could happen, and that's not in the interest of the United States. But the great ally, one of the major historical allies of the United States in the region, which is Jordan, if you carry out an ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from the West Bank and push them there, the most likely outcome is that the monarchy would fall. And from there, the chaos that could follow would be tremendous. You could even end up with a Palestinian government, and then you'd have a Palestinian state facing Israel against Israel's interests, and that would go against Israel itself. That is to say, it's an absolutely absurd and unworkable idea. So this shows either that the guy doesn't care what he says, just like with the numbers, right? What difference does it make to say 50,000 or 70,000? What do I care? Or that we have a problem because we're dealing with a guy and some advisors who are the ones who should at least be telling him what's going on in the region, who have no idea. They're telling me things that, even if they're immoral, or rather being immoral, are also unworkable. In other words, it's not viable, it's not possible. I mean, I can't go to the Andromeda Galaxy. Well, you can't do that, because if you do, it goes against the interests of the United States. Mainly because Egypt is an ally of the United States. Let's not forget that. Even though it later maintains good relations and does things with the Russians, the Chinese, and many others. But destabilizing Egypt, the most important Arab country in terms of population and a strategic one because of its location, besides, as I said, it would be an unthinkable chaos. So, well, this shows that this man either doesn't get it, doesn't want to get it, or just talks for the sake of talking. This must be the Israelis' idea of a humanitarian response.
Indeed, footage from a few hours ago shows the airstrikes once again over Gaza.
That's how the Israelis understand peace, yes.
Estas las consecuencias.
These are the consequences.
Esto, Fernando, por cierto, nosotros aquí...
This, Fernando, by the way, we predicted it here. At the time, when we presented the agreement, we said that the breakup would come soon, and indeed we are now witnessing the collapse of this supposed ceasefire agreement. It's nothing more than a pause. We described it as such at the time, one that Netanyahu's government would soon violate. And the violation has already begun. By the way, this situation once again led to the suspension of a new summons to Netanyahu's justice. What a coincidence. Also, more images. Tremendous. More images over here.
Más imágenes. Más imágenes por aquí.
For this kind of thing, really, even a Nuremberg tribunal wouldn't be enough. Well, this is, according to Israel's understanding, what peace agreements are. On the other side, I can't do anything, but I, from time to time, can bomb a little, because there's no problem. And as we pointed out, unfortunately, these are not peace agreements. Israel, and Netanyahu in particular, have no interest in making peace, either with the Palestinians or with others in the region. They want a continuous, permanent war. That's what they're doing. And well, they're doing it again. That is, they're attacking areas of Gaza under any pretext. It's the complete opposite, that is, and this has been proven. How many times did we say, no, this, well, just let the exchange happen? Well, above all, that Hamas and company carry out the exchange of hostages, that they hand over the hostages to the Israelis. They've given back the hostages who were alive and some of the dead ones. And well, since the others are very hard to find, as Hamas itself said today, look, this is all rubble, you'll have to go and look for them under the debris. We don't have the equipment for that. Israel has refused to bring in heavy machinery to search for the bodies of those Israeli citizens who are still out there. Of course, meaning, more or less, Hamas probably knows where some of them are, but you'd have to dig and search. Well, they've refused, and since they've already returned the living ones, they must have said, I've got enough of the dead ones, that's it, I don't need any more, I'm going back to my plans.
These images, Fernando, of Gazans themselves searching for the bodies of the dead hostages, using their own machinery, possibly the last excavators and loaders they have left, looking for the bodies in the tunnels. What a difference in how human beings are regarded, isn't it? Here, the search, the political agreements, and so on, for the hundreds of thousands of dead Palestinians, interest no one in the world. All of them under the rubble, and the search is carried out, well, as best the poor Gazans can. But that doesn't cause any kind of concern for any world leader. Meanwhile, the bodies of these hostages do trigger the start of negotiations, international involvement, condemnations, and so on. Not citizens, but human beings of different classes. One thing for Israelis, another for Gazans.
Well, the same thing. That is, exactly the same idea, or the same ideology, or the same conception of human beings that the man with the mustache had. There are proper human beings, and then subhumans, meaning different categories, but ones that cannot be compared to the superior race of the moment, or the chosen people of the moment. Well, this is what we have. That's why we can hear absolutely brutal things from Israeli leaders themselves. They don't hold back. It's not that they say, no, I sense, or from the actions I see I can somehow infer things. No. They state it openly. There was an Israeli former member of parliament who saw a video where the guy was saying, yes, that they had to get rid of them all without any problem. A former Israeli MP just saying it outright, you know. In other words, these people have to be wiped out, not the Palestinians. None of them left. Well, this, of course, in light of this, what characterized them? Well, that, as a kind of subhumans, well, this is what we have. That is, that's how it is. Of course, with this conception of what Palestinians are like and what Israelis are like, even among Israelis themselves, there are also categories. That is, some Israelis are not the same as others because some had special rights. Being able to devote themselves to studies without having to work, to the study of the Talmud, all kinds of things, and without having to do mandatory military service. So we're already establishing two categories of Israeli citizens. Those who go because they have no other choice, and those who don't go because they're exempt, because they're studying religious texts. What is that? I mean, just to give a well-known example, without any problem.
What is this? And with mandatory parliamentary representation, with a reserved quota for them.
This thing about quotas is very democratic. But well, I mean, that's why I say, well, then it's that the very conception of the state, this image they present of Israel as the great democracy of Western Asia, is a big lie.
In addition to the attacks, the Israeli government ordered the suspension of humanitarian aid and reimposed a blockade, even though, according to the agreement signed as part of the ceasefire, They were supposed to reopen the Al Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt. They reopened it for a few days, but when the attacks resumed, they blocked it again. Israel is attacking Gaza and reimposing the blockade as the fragile ceasefire collapses. I read somewhere that it might have been reopened a few hours later, but this has not been confirmed.
Habían reactivado unas horas después, pero esto sin confirmación. Aquí, por cierto, la opinión...
Here, by the way, the opinion on this comes from none other than the Minister of the Interior, Itamar Ben-Gvir. He celebrated the Prime Minister's decision to suspend humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. This specifically refers to the closure of the Al Rafah crossing. There's no need to resume that aid. The war, yes, and as soon as possible. He wants the war to resume, and that's also the political threat, because without the support of his political faction, Netanyahu's government would basically have to give up political power, right? It would disappear.
Exactly. Look, I was just looking for it here. I'm reading the statement more or less from former Israeli lawmaker Moshe Feiglin on an Israeli news program. He said the following, verbatim. As Hitler said, this is what he said, right? I can't live if there's even one Jew left. So we can't live here if there's even one Palestinian left in Gaza. Just like that, right? I mean, I'm not the one saying it. They are. And it's documented. There's a video. Yes, I have it here. That is, we're not showing it because obviously it can't be shown. But this guy says it calmly. A former member of the Knesset, that is, the Israeli parliament. Well, they keep saying things like that. This Itamar Ben-Gvir, for example, who is disgraceful, a savage, a brute, went off to have some fun when the members of the flotilla were imprisoned there in Israel after being captured. He went to the prisons to laugh at them and give them a little bit of torture so they'd get the message. And it was recorded on video because they filmed it and everything with him saying, "What? What do you say now? What now?" Now that you're in prison and we're here subjecting you to, well, not very good treatment? What now? Just like that. I mean, these are the fanatics who are in charge of Israel, the Zionists who are in charge of Israel. Well, as I said, you don't even need to do much research. They say it themselves. I mean, we could make a list, if we started looking, a list of their statements, from saying that atomic bombs should be dropped, just like that on Gaza. This was said at the beginning, to all kinds of atrocities. So, well, of course they expose themselves. There's not much more to add. So, well, as I was saying, we already knew this. Mr. Netanyahu is not going to end his state of permanent war. Now he's starting again with the Palestinians. Then, well, he's never really stopped with the Lebanese, because in the meantime he's been bombing yesterday, the day before, I think, also bombing Lebanon. Again, once more. Well, wait, pause. We'll see what happens with the Iran issue. Today I was talking with some fairly well-informed people, and due to the arrival of Russian military equipment in Iran, and also Chinese, because we can verify this among other things, since Russian and Chinese military planes have been arriving, you can tell the place of departure and the destination, right? Which means, obviously, if they're military planes, and not just one or two, but quite a few, then they're delivering military equipment. And we can more or less guess what kind of equipment they're bringing. I mean, they're not delivering, I don't know, mattresses for sleeping in tents, right? No, they're delivering electronic warfare systems, radar systems, anti-air defense systems. That's what's going on, even MiG-29 aircraft. Well, we'll see. Because if Netanyahu launches an attack against Iran, in principle, it seems they're now much better prepared than before. Apparently, of course. You can never say anything until the facts actually happen. And he should think twice, because let's not forget that the major media outlets are always telling us the story as if it were a great triumph for Israel and a great triumph for Trump and so on. No, not at all. What's happening in Gaza is a crushing defeat for Mr. Netanyahu. That is, he has not achieved the military objectives he set for himself. He has not been able to defeat Hamas, which means it's a defeat, and therefore a victory for Hamas, whether we like it or not. That's how it is. It's an objective fact. The same thing happened with the 12-day war. It's been acknowledged and proven that Mr. Netanyahu, 4 or 5 days in, was already calling for a ceasefire, for negotiations, for something to be done to put an end to it because they were being devastated. What we were saying, for all kinds of reasons, because of the country's size, among other things, it's already been confirmed through testimonies. What we were also saying, that the whole thing was a sham. What Trump did by bombing the nuclear facilities, well, yes, he bombed them, but it didn't amount to much, because one of the measures they took to protect them was to seal the entrances with rubble and other things. And well, what we've been seeing these days, and also in previous days, this isn't new, is that it's become clear again how the entrances were being reopened, the debris cleared away, and how work was being carried out without major issues because no real damage had been done, because it was all arranged. That is, just like the attack on the US base in Qatar was arranged, where there was no one, everyone had left, it was empty, everything was staged, a show to be able to say we've won, that we've solved the problem of Iran's nuclear facilities and thus stopped the war, because they were losing it. That war was lost by Israel and by the United States, insofar as it supports Israel. In other words, it must be clear that for the moment, Israel has done nothing but lose wars and battles.
Fernando,
we can wrap up the issue of Gaza with another atrocity, the candidate for a seat in Congress. And of course, Hamas violated the peace agreement. Now they are.
And of course, Hamas violated the peace deal. Now they're...
Again.
I'm in Israel, and of course, Hamas broke the ceasefire, and now we're bombing them. That's why I've got my popcorn, or pochoclos, as we call them in Argentina. I've got my popcorn ready. Let the fireworks begin. Music, and there today's explosions again. How are you, Valentina Gomez?
Well, it's unfortunate, but also wearing the t-shirt just in case there was any doubt with what looks like an American assault rifle. An M16, I think it is, or maybe an M19, I don't remember anymore. But anyway, and with the popcorn, right?
They say, look. Well, let me correct myself. She's a candidate from Texas indeed for the National Congress. Not a candidate for the Texas State Congress, but for the National Congress representing Texas, District number 31.
They know, unfortunately, that the Jewish lobby is very influential, and not just because of its influence, but because of the money it provides. That is, an election campaign has to be paid for, and that's very expensive. And the donors, well, we already know who they are. If you have the Jewish lobby behind you and it supports you, it not only gives you money, not directly, but through other channels, let's say. It also makes other large companies that are somehow connected to that lobby contribute as well. And it's essential in the United States to have money, because without money it's impossible to win an election campaign. Impossible. Sometimes you lose even with money, but you need money. And this young lady, or woman, I'm not sure, thought that the best way to win the electoral support of the Jewish lobby and its money in order to win the campaign and get a seat in Texas or wherever was to do this foolish thing. Well then, this is the reality of the United States and its politicians. The good thing is that they expose themselves, all of them, the Israelis, the Americans, the Europeans.
Sí, de alguna manera, Fernando, sin quererlo, a lo largo de la
Somehow, Fernando, without meaning to, throughout the broadcast, in the different topics, we keep presenting various issues, and, as a common thread, the social, political, and economic decline of the United States appears at every level. From the murder of fishermen under the pretext of drug trafficking, because they want Venezuela's oil resources, the protests, and the president responding with a video bombing the supposed demonstrators with feces, that furious woman just now, a ceasefire supposedly carried out, of course, so that Trump could finally win the Nobel Peace Prize, violated 5 days later. Trump's confession about his desire for a real estate project involving the ethnic cleansing of Gazans, and their replacement by younger people from Israel, obviously. A picture of the civilizational decay of the United States. This is the world of our present, but also a very dangerous one, because empires, generally, do not disappear without a final battle before their decline. And of course, this is an empire with nuclear weapons, right?
Decadencia, y claro, es un imperio con armas nucleares, ¿no? Es el problema.
Y están en ello,
That's the problem. And they're on it, huh? We're not going to get into that now. But, I mean, they're on it, and they're fighting in many ways, in many places. In some, visibly, and in others, barely visible or downright invisible. For example, to mention one case, they're not only fighting against their enemies, let's say the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, which they are, but also from time to time, well, not just from time to time, quite often, they fight against their allies. The second to last case was the uprisings in Madagascar, where they took down the pro-French president, or France's ally, and just put in one of their own. I mean, this might need some work, but anyway, one day we can sit down and go over the map and we'll see that they're acting everywhere, practically wherever there's an interest. And that's just talking about the more or less visible things, because they bomb, because they stage color revolutions, things like that. Imagine what they do invisibly, right? I mean, well, it's one outrage after another. Legal outrages, economic outrages, moral outrages. Like that thing, which you've probably already talked about, I suppose, the Mesperia case, that Dutch company. Just because I feel like it, I tell the Dutch to dig up some law from who knows when, from the Cold War era or whatever, and to apply it for me, basically.
Communists, Petro, Maduro, the candidate for mayor of New York. In the end, the Dutch carrying out communist expropriations. The Chinese, Fernando, or am I mistaken, turn out to be the least communist.
Because they're the only ones who, to some extent, respect the free market and competition. This is without competition. How are we supposed to compete with our... Let's get into liberal theory mode, right? Neoliberals, right? The ones who defend free competition and the free market. Well, this is the most anti-free competition, anti-free market thing there is. And how do we compete with the Chinese? By expropriating companies, which is the most free market thing ever, right? The let do, let pass idea. I mean, well, this is what they're doing. Since they can't compete with them, they go all out, either destroy everything or take it all. And now we're in a dramatic situation in Europe because that company was the main supplier of microchips to Europeans. And of course now there's been, you know it well, a statement from a German business association related to these matters saying, hey, we're running out of microchips. In other words, they're sinking Germany even further.
Last topic for this broadcast, Ukraine. Although, by the way, we could, as a footnote, present Putin's words from yesterday because he specifically referred to this situation in Europe and its, how should I put it, stupidity, foolishness, shooting itself in the foot. Well, this decision to abandon the economic ties with Russia, which was so beneficial, and to trade cheap Russian energy for European manufactured goods, and precisely the destruction of European industry as a consequence. And, by the way, the Reich's import substitution manufacturing industry. From Putin's own words, this was yesterday before we begin with Ukraine.
palabras de Putin esto de ayer, antes de que comencemos con Ucrania. Atención a este discurso ya subtitulado. Por cierto,
Pay attention to this speech, already subtitled. By the way, all the previous images from Gaza were taken from our sister channel Wars and Geopolitics, a brother, a friend, a partner. Don't miss out, a Telegram channel we always recommend. So our thanks to them, and our recommendation. If anyone is on Telegram looking for information in Spanish about geopolitics and geoeconomics, the Wars and Geopolitics channel is definitely a must. And with that said, now, Putin's words.
Las palabras de Putin. Segundito para atrás, un poquito más bajo.
Just a second back, a little lower, and they were pushed to resign. Their production stops being profitable, their work collectives shrink, technologies start to be lost, and our specialists grow and become technological leaders because, for their part, they manage to keep production at a good level of profitability. And countries all over the world appear that today buy this equipment. Fernando, crystal clear, right?
Купил билет и не поехал на зло кондуктору. Чушь какая-то, понимаете? Ерунда. Но вот это реалии сегодняшнего.
Crystal clear. By the way, he gave this speech during Energy Week over in Russia. I've been able to read the full transcript, and it's very interesting because he talked more about energy, gave data, and so on. But what he points out, I mean, it's crazy stuff. This can only be understood from the perspective of some globalist elites who want to bring down Europe. Just like that, right? Why?
Cargarse Europa. Tal cual, ¿eh? ¿Por qué? Porque piensan en sus disparates, piensan que...
Because they think they're nonsense. They think that as globalists, the destruction of the sovereign European states, or the national European states, which become completely subsumed within the European Union as a large regional organization, would ultimately allow for a European government and moreover a corporate European government, where the big North American corporations, by the way, would be the ones dividing up the spoils. Therefore, we must keep in mind that European governments, unlike those of other countries, in Russia, in China, may do better or worse, but they are very clear that Putin or Xi Jinping are trying to improve the conditions of their countries and defend their countries' interests. Although sometimes the interests, and we say it very clearly, although sometimes the interests of their countries are driven by political realism, political pragmatism, and Putin has to meet with the head chopper of the Syrian jihadists. That's how it is, let's not fool ourselves. But they defend what they believe to be their interests. The thing is, in Europe, our leaders defend the interests of the United States and its multinationals. They don't defend the interests of their citizens or their states. That's the problem. And of course, from there, between that and their blatant incompetence, already proven many times, we have disaster served on a platter. And from there, I say, Europe has no solution. We're going to crash spectacularly, something historic. We're getting poorer at an incredible speed. The other day I was talking about, and I'm sure you've talked about it too, what's happening in Greece. They're dragging us into something terrible. A law has just been passed in Parliament, yes, with a lot of social protests, but they didn't care. That allows employers at their discretion, meaning whenever they feel like it, to have 37 days a year in which they can legally require their employees to work 13-hour days. 13 hours. We've gone back to the 19th century, to the Industrial Revolution. The next step, having 7-year-old children work. 13 hours. This has been approved, you know?
13 horas. Esto está aprobado, ¿eh? 13 horas. No se han atrevido por el momento nada más que a
13 hours. For now, they've only dared to set it at 37 days a year. Fine. But once you start, next year they'll make it 55, then more, and in the end you'll have the whole year. 13 hours. It's something, I mean, Europe going back to a situation like that of the 19th century or earlier. Countries like China are moving forward, and we're moving backward. It's something never seen before. Well, this is the blatant labor exploitation we're entering into. As we can see in international politics, everything is blatant. The only good thing now is that no one even bothers to look for loopholes or justifications anymore. What for? We just go ahead and do something outrageous and feel perfectly fine about it. Fine then.
Tal cual, tal cual. Comencemos con Gaza.
Exactly. Let's start with Gaza after what happened in Washington. Zelensky's visit to the White House, awaiting the delivery of the Tomahawk missiles, the call the day before between Trump and Putin, the announcement of a meeting, and Trump's refusal to deliver the Tomahawk missiles. Here are Trump's words yesterday about Ukraine.
Trump proves us right, that they weren't going to give the Tomahawks.
Fernando saying this all the time. At one point, I had doubts that they might launch one just as a provocation, the small ones, but for now, no. Here's Trump yesterday, Fernando. We can't hand over all our weapons to Ukraine.
We simply can't do it. I've been very good to Zelensky and to Ukraine.
But I can't put the United States at risk. I can't hand over all the weapons. And by the way, and we presented this yesterday at the joint press conference with Zelensky, it was actually a joint thing, like the press conference with Milley, right? Zelensky sitting there, silent, and he answering the questions, even the trick questions from his journalist friend, meant for Zelensky. Without meaning to, Trump, the loudmouth, made a confession. Have you talked about Peter Hegeset's tie, the secretary of? Naturally, we also presented Peter Hegeset's Russian tie, but I wanted to recall precisely the trick question, or in this case a Trump question, a gift of a question, from his journalist friend. President Trump, if we deliver so many weapons to Ukraine, won't we run out of weapons ourselves? And Trump replied, indeed, if we send off the Tomahawk missiles and other weapons, then we won't be able to establish a security guarantee for the United States if we make so many shipments that we now appear short on armaments. Something we've both said, Fernando. How many times? About US arsenals with the war in Israel, with the war in Ukraine, with Yemen, finally confirmed by Trump.
It's well known that the American military-industrial complex is deeply inefficient, but so deeply inefficient that it makes the supply of weaponry a disaster, an absolute disaster in the United States. Because first, there's the whole concept of armament, right? Very expensive and scarce weapons, and very technological, very advanced, right? Technologically and so on. This creates a problem. You don't have the capacity to produce significant quantities. So, the moment you've launched 50 or 60 Tomahawks, you say, hey, I've used up the whole year's supply. Yesterday I showed a chart of those who have launched, of those who have produced in recent years. There was one year when they didn't produce a single one, not one, absolutely zero. And the highest number, I think, was around 200. And in the last year shown about 50 per year, right? Of course. The moment you carry out 4 attacks and 4 bombings, you've used up the 50 you made that year, plus another 20 or 30 you had in stock. In any minor bombing, one of those insignificant ones, they can't supply them. But there are also other reasons. One is that the Tomahawks have technology. There are many factors, but this one alone is enough. They have sufficiently advanced technology, and the United States hardly shares that with anyone. And even less with the Ukrainians, who would resell it to anyone, to the highest bidder. That is to say, no. But as we were saying, the military-industrial complex is profoundly inefficient. They've known this for a long time. Spectacular delays. For example, you have a contract, and you're supposed to deliver certain weapons a certain quantity by 2011. You don't deliver them in 2011, nor in 2012, nor in 2013. And maybe as many as 10 years could go by before you start delivering, because there are delays, things have happened, whatever. The same goes for the issue of quantities, for production lines that have been abandoned, because the US conception of war was an asymmetric one, where you don't need large quantities of weapons. And now we're in a war like the one in Ukraine, where the amounts of weapons and ammunition are enormous. So you're not prepared for the war that has come upon you now, nor were you expecting it. I mean, but as I said, they know this, and it can't be fixed. Because if politics, that is, if the government, were the one in charge of the American military-industrial complex, well, there would be a chance to rein in the big companies like Raytheon, Boeing, or Northrop Grumman. But since it's the military-industrial complex that controls politics, there's no way. You can't do anything. In other words, this has no solution. And we're going to see it more and more. A very inefficient military-industrial complex, with increasingly scarce weaponry and no production capacity. And we're seeing it. And also, with a certain conception. The other day I was reading something interesting, well, something I agree with. What is the, if we have to choose one, these things are always debatable. What is the key element, the revolutionary weapon, so to speak, of this war in Ukraine, right? The weapon system, however we want to call it. We'd all say, well, drones, okay, but there are many kinds of drones. What kind of drone? Well, I'd say something very interesting. It's not the big drone like the Americans had, expensive ones like the Global Hawk or the Reaper. No. It's the cheap drone, the one that costs a few $100s that you can buy. It's a civilian drone. And what is a civilian drone? A drone with a camera, one that can be shot down, and it doesn't matter, because they have thousands of them. That civilian drone is what has allowed you to do something completely new, which is to have, let's say, a permanent, what they call in military terms, awareness of your situational field. In plain language, you can have constant real-time knowledge through cheap little drones that are on the front line and observing everything happening several kilometers away. And those drones are, well, civilian drones. Anyone can buy them. I mean, you go on Amazon and buy your drone. In fact, we're seeing it in the war in Ukraine, on both the Ukrainian and Russian sides. There are organizations that support soldiers. People chip in some money, they buy drones and send them over. These kinds of civilian drones.
Over here are the demolishers, Fernando, going crazy over what they claim is the rarest of all rare earths, a material called moragonium, which according to them is extremely valuable but very scarce, and radioactive too. Over here, Zelensky, interviewed last night on American television about the Tomahawks. Pay attention to his words.
And to be honest, it's good that President Trump didn't say no.
Asked about Trump's response, Zelensky replies, "It's good that President Trump didn't say no. But for now, he hasn't said yes either. Back then, he didn't say yes to the Tomahawk missiles. He was answering the reporter's question."
I mean, this is a sensitive question. It's a sensitive question, and
I mean, it's a sensitive issue.
Messages from President that it's not enough for American interests.
According to President Trump, the number of Tomahawk missiles is not enough for US national interest. Lately, Zelensky, or rather Zelensky, either responds nonsensically on purpose, or he already seems so high, so out of it, that when he can't answer a question, he starts a sentence, abandons it halfway, starts another, and so on. He answers without answering the tough questions. 2 minutes of talking, and he said nothing, all babbling, an incredible thing, hiding behind his terrible English. But well, neither yes nor no, Fernando, which maybe isn't.
Pero bueno, ni no ni sí, Fernando, lo cual igual no.
A ver, esto, pues eso, es decir,
Let's see this.
tiene que intentar zafarse de la pregunta.
Well, that's it. I mean, he has to try to dodge the question. He's not going to say, well, he told me no, what can you do? No. He has to say, well, he didn't say no, which is something positive, right? He didn't say yes either, but, well, in the future, since he didn't say no, he might say yes. And who knows, you can't change a yes, but you can change a no. And it's just a joke, I mean. And then he starts with the whole, no, well, but I understand, because of course, the United States has a lot of responsibilities in the world and all that, and they're running out of weapons. So, well, of course I get it, but still, surely in the future when they have more weapons and so on, they'll give them to us and all that. Well, they make fools of themselves, but anyway, after what I've seen, who cares?
And this version from the Financial Times released today says that Trump urged Zelensky to accept Putin's terms, or he would be destroyed by Russia. The President of the United States displayed maps of the Ukrainian front during a volatile meeting at the White House. And, according to other reports, also published by the Financial Times, Zelensky rejected this request from Trump through his representative, Vitkov. True? False? What's your take on this, Fernando?
¿Verdad? ¿Mentira? ¿Cuál tu visión, Fernando, sobre esto?
Well, let's see, to know what went on behind the scenes, right? But anyway, it's clear that they're saying, I don't know if it's true or not, that it was a huge argument, that Trump was already tired of Zelensky, told him to get lost, and on top of that, the maps Zelensky had, the photos, the maps, whatever, he threw them, tossed them aside, and said, leave me alone. Well, we already know what Trump's style is like. So he probably got fed up with Zelensky and said, look, stop bothering me, no maps or anything, I'll do whatever I want, period. And you'll take whatever I give you. He's giving him quite a lot, huh? Let's not think that Trump has now said, no, I'm not giving him anything. No, he's still giving him a lot of stuff, especially intelligence, which is key for guiding the missiles they have now, right? That is to say, the drones, these drones we're seeing that are carrying out deep attacks, which are often like little planes and so on, right? And that have a very long range that can reach 2,000 kilometers and sometimes even go beyond the Urals. Well, these drones don't just fly off on their own. It's not like they just arrive and boom, hit the target. They're being fed live, real-time information. That is, as I was saying before, where using GPS. The Americans are detecting Russian weapon systems and even spotting the gaps between those systems where the drones can slip through, and they're guiding them. Look, what we're seeing, when a Ukrainian drone, boom, hits an oil refinery, I don't know, 1,000 kilometers away or so. The Ukrainians aren't launching drones like this just for fun. They're doing it with information, with direction, and with targeting, and they're being given objectives, as I said, and the Americans are directly guiding them. In other words, they're doing a lot. In fact, all the punishment the Russians are receiving regarding oil and so on is, let's say, pre-programmed or directed by the White House, by Trump himself, as a means of pressuring Putin. That is, look, we're hitting your gas storage systems, oil facilities, refineries, and so on, because we're the ones directing the Ukrainians toward these targets. So if you don't accept what we're presenting to you, you'll keep having these kinds of problems. In other words, Trump is actively participating. And what's even more important than that is the intelligence. Because that thing about sending, let's imagine he had sent about 4 Tomahawks, or that he sends them in the future. It doesn't matter. That's not going to change the course of the war. Well, it might destroy a few more things, period. Surely the Russians will be able to hit back harder by targeting Ukrainian energy facilities. But by the way, what's being demonstrated, and we've mentioned this once or twice before, is how tough and well-built the energy facilities and all kinds of factories in Ukraine are, dating back to the Soviet Union era.
de la época de la Unión Soviética. Esto que nos contaban, no, es que los soviéticos son...
That story they told us, that the Soviets are nothing, that everything is a disaster, that they do everything wrong, that they have no technology, and so on. Well, that's just not the case. I mean, I'd like to see how long Western factories would hold up under bombardment with this kind of guided weaponry, like guided bombs, the Fab 5000s, 3,000 kilos each. Let's see how long they'd last. Well, no, these ones hold up a lot because they're very well built and also huge. So, well, they endure, they can withstand almost anything. Some of them were even designed to resist nuclear attacks. So that's the difficulty the Russians are facing.
De ahí la dificultad que tienen los rusos. Que no es...
It's not that... Anyway, by the way, at the risk of being wrong again, because I said Pokrovsk would fall in August and it hasn't fallen in either August or September, it's true that the Ukrainians, facing a situation where they were in very bad shape, on the verge of collapse, started sending in troops like there was no tomorrow, and that has obviously slowed down the advances in Pokrovsk. But right now the situation, based on what I read yesterday and so on, from both sides, makes it seem to me that it's already unsustainable. Let's say the whole area, well, if we look at a map, basically I think it can be divided into two parts.
Presentemos el mapa en un segundo, Fernando. Primero...
Let's show the map in a second, Fernando. First, we'll wrap this up, and then show the map with the analysis. The latest from Zelensky, in that interview with an interesting association. This is the new one. Putin, same as always. Never the same Putin. This is Zelensky, ladies and gentlemen. Here he is. Attention.
Señoras y señores, con ustedes. Atención.
Success with Israel and Hamas.
President Trump's success in Gaza was due to the pressure he put on all parties.
Se debió a que aplicó presión a todas las partes. Atención al grado de delirio de la...
Pay attention to the level of delusion in the media's narrative. Trump's success in the ceasefire, a ceasefire already violated today by Israel, concerns a conflict in which he was not only an ally, but also an accomplice, supplying weapons to Israel. So this idea of Trump the mediator is pure delusion, a fallacy. Pressure on both sides? Pressure means sending weapons to Israel for the bombing of children. But anyway, that's the question within this delirious media narrative. And now Zelensky's response. Well then, since in Gaza, Trump supposedly applied pressure on both sides, he should now apply more pressure on Putin himself. And here's Zelensky's little face, about to respond.
What a nerve.
Oh, with a pout, a little pout. Yes, about to cry. Yes, and now he's going to answer.
And even more.
Because
he should respond with even more pressure than he did to Hamas. Because Putin is something similar, but stronger than Hamas.
It's bigger than a war. And it's the second largest army in the world.
This is a bigger war, and Putin has the second most powerful armed forces in the world. That's why, more pressure, darling. Zelensky's English is terrible, but no, never. And Putin, basically the same. Fernando, we're confused here.
But like twin brothers, that is, Hamas and Putin. I mean, two things that are no different from each other. The same as me and Julius Caesar. Come on, this is delusional. He doesn't know what to say anymore. The guy's gone too far, over the line too, right? Yes, over the line too. Yes. This man really, what does Hamas have to do with Putin and therefore with Russia? Nothing. We're talking about completely different things. We're talking about one of the most powerful states in the world, the one with the most powerful and most modern nuclear arsenal in the world, qualitatively speaking, incomparable. We're talking about a country with 146 or 147 million inhabitants versus an organization that isn't even an army. It's a militia, at best, a guerrilla group, that was fighting there with RPG grenades, that is, grenade launchers, the most sophisticated weapons they had. So it's something absurd, right? But then they say, no, well, of course, yes, the Russians have more power and all that. And about the pressure, this part I love, the pressure, right? The pressure, blood pressure. Well, I don't know which pressure. I mean, let's see. You can put pressure on someone who's much weaker or weaker than you, but against Russia, against China, applying pressure, or against the United States too, is very difficult, because we're talking about the big three. So yes, Trump can try to apply pressure just like others can, but Putin has already said it 100 times. Sure, he thinks what you're proposing is fine, but he's sticking to his guns. And look, this thing about how in June 2024 we already made the last proposal, and that I keep repeating to you over and over, well, that's just how it is. Take it or leave it. What, am I going to pressure you? How are you going to pressure me? You've already done everything. I mean, the sanctions you've imposed on me are honestly historic. Besides, sure, you can apply pressure, but the one being pressured can also push back. And then they can say, go ahead, pressure me. But look, enriched uranium, only I can make it, because only Russia has the capacity to produce the entire cycle, from extracting uranium from the mine, separating it from the ore, processing it, enriching it, and so on, until it's ready to be delivered to the nuclear plant before it goes into the reactor. Only Russia can do that. So in fact, they sell that processed material to the Americans. They could say, well, look, I'll stop selling it to you. And then the American nuclear power plants wouldn't have replacements. In other words, they wouldn't have fuel. In fact, that's the reason why, what a coincidence, the United States hasn't imposed sanctions on the Russians in the nuclear field, unlike the European Union. That is because they would run out of fuel.
Dear Fernando, it starts at DMP Santiago Martinez. Please, in just 2 minutes, I'd like an overview of the front, given the latest developments. Can you help us, dear Fernando?
All right, I'll go quickly, straight to the point. Basically, Pokrovsk, everything indicates that the city, let's imagine it as roughly circular, is split in half, north and south, while the southern half, which is crossed by the railway line, everything suggests that this part is already in Russian hands. The northern half remains, but with disorganization and an inability on the Ukrainian side to bring in more people, because they practically no longer control any of the logistical lines. Everything points to it falling. There aren't many options left. Then what we're seeing in the north, for example, Kupiansk, another strategic location, well, practically the vast majority of the city is already taken by the Russians. There's just a small part left. Nothing in the media about that, Fernando. Nothing. Nothing at all. But look, the Russian vanguards, are practically on the outskirts of Lyman.
From the Lima class, that is. Even today, when looking at a pro-Ukrainian map, they reject the situation in Pokrovsk, and there the delimitation is sometimes more difficult. But on the pro-Ukrainian maps of the north, the city in the north, the city just mentioned, Kupiansk, exactly. Well, a blank in my head. Kupiansk. According to their own maps, Russia has practically already conquered the entire city, at least the whole part on one side of the river, and has almost created a complete encirclement, exactly. Yes, because also...
No. But also, they've taken the part, let's see, the Oskil River, which divides the city in two. The larger part, which is, as we can see here, more or less the more complicated one. So they could trap those who are here, as you can see. That is, here's a river, the Oskil, here are the Ukrainians. They've taken the western part of the city, and what remains to be taken is the eastern part. But with little way out now. Well, that's how things stand, Bohodukhiv. I don't know if you remember Bohodukhiv, also in Kharkiv. They've been fighting there for a year and a half. I can't even remember anymore.
Ahí han estado peleándose año y medio, ni me acuerdo ya. Bueno, pues los últimos avances hacen que hayan traspasado el río.
Well, the latest advances mean they've crossed the river too. And further up, there it is. If you get closer, you'll see they've crossed the river, that what we see as a gray area is already occupied, and that what remains is the greenish zone. In other words, not just the Reds, but all of this is already in Russian hands. This one is going to fall soon. And like this one, several more will keep falling because there have been very significant advances. Seversk, for example, Kupiansk, they keep moving forward. There they are. It might take longer, but I'm mainly saying this because of Pokrovsk. Since the moment Pokrovsk falls, the Russians will advance north and west. And toward the west, they're making progress both through Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk, moving very quickly for this kind of positional warfare. They're already very close to Yudapol, the last defensive belt, so to speak, of cities held by the Ukrainians. They've already taken several of them. In fact, Poltava, not the large Poltava, but a small locality, a village, has already been captured. And they're advancing in Dnipropetrovsk, already pushing more than 20 kilometers deep from the administrative border. And as I said, this isn't even the main advance. Once Pokrovsk is liberated, part of those forces will head north, and another part will reinforce this sector. From that point on, the disaster will be enormous. And all this with a very harsh winter.
To wrap up our section, Meanwhile in China. And by the way, to those who are connected, more than 2,100 demolishers, we're still below 2,000 likes. So please help us fight the permanent demonetization of all analyses about Gaza, Israel, and so on. Please help us out with a thumbs up by sharing, commenting, subscribing. And of course, if you'd like to support us through memberships or PayPal, that's also appreciated. And with DMP Geopolitics, where Santiago Martinez is already starting right now. To close, a palate cleanser, something a bit more pleasant after so many grim topics. Check this out, Chinese drones in the sky, but for a light show. Tremendous. Spectacular.
Tremendo. Espectacular.
It's that they're already doing real... Yes, they're spectacular. They even mix them from time to time with fireworks. I mean, the drones themselves carry fireworks and create a huge show. I mean...
In this video, what's interesting at the beginning is that you can clearly see the rise of the drones. Not just the light, but the drones themselves. There and over here, another one doing the same thing, but with other spectacular images too, without music. This is filmed by another drone, of course. Incredible. Almost like a computer animation, but no. These drones. And on top of that, the drone, like everything, is...
He gets in the way to film.
Yes, that combined there with drones launching fireworks.
No, look, a lotus flower.
Yes, we're presenting it without music because of copyright issues. Here's the girl with...
an impressive lotus flower. They're doing amazing things now. They can make all kinds of images. People, objects, animals, whatever they want.
Well, something nice to wrap up. Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, 1,000 thanks as always. To the 2,100 amazing people connected, thank you so much for joining us, and please give us a thumbs up. Fernando, my friend, as always, a pleasure. See you next Wednesday, right? Exactly. See you Wednesday. Everyone, head over right now to DMP Geopolitics, the link is below, to Santiago Martinez's broadcast about the purge within the PLA, the Chinese People's Army. Fascinating. Trump, Zelensky, and Putin. Hugs, bye-bye.
Hasta luego.